Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to an essay video series by yours truly, the Sea Monster, and it is all gonna be on Godzilla, the 2014 version. Godzilla 2014, directed by Gareth Edwards, is the first film in the Monsterverse, a shared universe that would eventually come to full fruition by Legendary Pictures after 2014's success to cross Godzilla over with King Kong in a future film. With this being the first film in the Monsterverse, it's ironically going to be the last film in said franchise that I will be covering here in order to be fully up to date in terms of doing essay videos on the Monsterverse, at least until a future installment comes out. Godzilla 2014 was a hotly anticipated film by the time it first came out, and while there are plenty of folks out there like yours truly who welcomed it with open arms as a worthy reboot / adaptation / foray into the King of the Monsters legacy, there was and still is a fair amount of folks out there who were disappointed by it and who still express that disappointment to this day. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the film stacks up almost a decade later, as of the recording of this particular string of videos. While I do agree that it's not the greatest Godzilla film to have ever Godzilla'd, I know that's not a real word, just go with it, trademark it, whatever. My hope with this essay video series is to shed some much needed light into how well crafted and well executed the film is, warts and all. Again, not to say that there aren't any flaws in the film, because there certainly are, I won't deny that, and we will go into them as they come up. But one thing that should not be expected of me to say is the phrase, and I quote, "not enough Godzilla." I just don't consider that to be a useful criticism for this film, especially considering we have beloved entries in Toho's side of Godzilla that featured him rather sparingly while still making him a major part of the story. But we'll go more into that point later in this series. And just like how I've done things with the other entries in the Monsterverse that I've already covered, I will be discussing Godzilla 2014 in regards to its overall quality, with emphasis on its objective merits, while any subjective input on my end will serve as an equivalent to extra credit for the film itself. It's basically how my essay videos are generally done on this channel. The things that we'll be discussing in Godzilla 2014 range from its story and thematic core to its characters, both human and monster, to its technical aspects such as visual effects and set pieces. Then we will reach an overall conclusion on the film's quality by the end of part 3 once we cross that bridge. So, now that we've gone over those ground rules, let's do a halo jump right into this thing, shall we? So before we really go into Godzilla 2014, a little summary on the film itself is in order. The film revolves around Ford Brody, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, a soldier and bomb defusal expert for the U.S. Army, who finds himself returning to his estranged father, Joe Brody, played by Bryan Cranston, after the latter makes a discovery regarding what was responsible for the sudden collapse of a nuclear power plant and evacuation of Janjira, Japan, which also resulted in the death of Ford's mother, Sandra, played by Juliette Binoche. The incident was covered up by Monarch, an organization that observes and studies mysterious giant creatures that are beginning to resurface. The arrival into Janjira of one giant creature, classified and referred to as throughout the film a massive unidentified terrestrial organism, or MUTO for short, is what caused this past disaster. When this MUTO rises from his metamorphosis in order to find and unite with its mate, which would go on to be discovered later on, Joe Brody is tragically killed, and this leaves Ford trying to return to his wife and son before the MUTOs could potentially kill them, just as they did his parents. Meanwhile, the MUTOs awakening, and the threat they pose on the Earth's natural order, should they consummate, have stirred an ancient apex predator into action to keep that natural order in check. And this apex predator is none other than the Big G himself, Godzilla. So now that we got the summary out of the way, let's go into the film's characters, particularly the more significant ones out of the bunch, while touching on some others as well. And obviously a good one to go into first is our lead character. Ford Brody witnessed his family being torn apart via his mother dying and his father Joe being overtaken by guilt and a seemingly futile search for answers by a mysterious event at the Janjira nuclear power plant when he was a boy. 15 years later, we see a fully grown Ford having returned home from a tour in the army and reuniting with his wife Elle, played by Elizabeth Olsen, and their son Sam. However, the reunion is cut short when he receives a phone call from Japan that his father is in jail, who was caught for trespassing in the now quarantined derelict Janjira. When his father convinces him to go back with him to Janjira, only for the both to be arrested as a result, Ford is taken to the old power plant where he and his father bear witness to the rise of the male Muto that was responsible for the family tragedy. However, Joe is killed by the Muto, and Ford sets out to return home and save his family when he is made aware by Monarch of the imminent threat that the Mutos pose, as well as the inevitable clash between them and Godzilla, which is set to take place in his home, San Francisco. One part of the film which bolsters Ford as a character worth getting behind is when he finds himself at risk of missing his flight in order to look after a young boy who's inadvertently separated from his family on a monorail in Hawaii. Ford even goes on to give the boy his old action figure from his childhood to comfort him and watch over him until he's reunited with his parents, especially when taking into consideration the fact that the male Muto and other creatures like him are out there. And of course, Ford saves the boy from falling to his death after the Muto tears through the monorail, ensuring that the boy's parents wouldn't endure a family tragedy much like what he and his father had gone through. Catharsis then comes in during the following morning after the battle at Hawaii, when the boy is finally reunited with his parents, who have also managed to survive, and Ford feels relief knowing that he at least helped in ensuring another family wouldn't suffer a similar fate as his own. Ford then goes on to help the military escort a couple of nuclear warheads to San Francisco, though that doesn't go without a Muto-sized hitch or two. After the Mutos have acquired the nukes, one for sustenance and the other for their nest, and after being made aware of his son being safe and out of the city but not his wife, Ford volunteers to help the Halo jump in order to disable the nuke before it detonates while Godzilla and the Mutos clash. Even knowing that he may not come out of the mission alive, Ford is willing to put his own life on the line in order to save his family, as well as the world, from the imminent threat. Not just when he joins the mission in the city, but also when he destroys the Muto's nest in order to stop the offspring from potentially hatching and to give Godzilla a chance to recover. Even when he finds himself face to face with the female Muto in a hopeless scenario, he isn't afraid to go out swinging by pulling out a pistol and ready to fight. However, thanks to Godzilla's sudden intervention and a chopper coming to his rescue, Ford is able to finally return home to his family. Ford Brody is a stronger character than people are willing to give him credit for. Aaron Taylor Johnson gives a very good performance where he is able to convey his character's emotions and what's going on inside that head of his in an understated manner. When he's with his wife and son, Ford displays a sense of happiness and content. But when he finds himself being forced to confront his tragic past as well as his father over the Janjira incident and the death of Sandra, he tries to repress that grief in an attempt to reach out to his father to move on. And while the love he has for his wife and son fuels his undying determination to return home to them, he is still more than willing to help when he is needed along the way. And a result of all that characterization and all those factors, Ford Brody is allowed to be a pretty solid protagonist in the long run. So let's move on to our next key character, who is none other than Ford's father, Joe Brody. We first meet Joe calling for a meeting at the Janjira nuclear plant to discuss the sudden seismic activity that has recently moved from the Philippines to right around his home. When he arrives, the seismic activity suddenly gets worse and worse to the point where it cripples the plant. His wife, who was sent in to inspect and assess the situation, finds herself and her colleagues overrun by the intense radiation that begins spilling out. Over the radio, she tells her husband to shut the door immediately. Despite all of his hesitation, Joe is forced to shut the door right before the radiation could leak out. He then witnesses his wife and others perishing as she tells him to take care of their son. Joe then hears a loud, bellowing roar, cluing him in that a large, mysterious creature is the cause of this tragedy. During the 15-year interim between when we last see Ford as a child and when we first meet him as an adult, his relationship with Joe was significantly strained due to the latter's obsession with uncovering the truth behind the Janjira disaster. Ford tries to convince his father to leave it all behind and move on so that he can finally meet his grandson. However, Joe convinces Ford to come with him in retrieving the data that was left behind in Janjira. Despite successfully acquiring the data from the ruins of their old home, Joe and Ford are both arrested by the authorities and taken into Monarch's facility in the derelict power plant for questioning. When being questioned, Joe retaliates and rants to Monarch officials, including Dr. Serizawa and Dr. Graham, who stand just outside the room, about how he knows that they're hiding something, and that he is owed answers because of the simple fact that his wife was killed by the very thing which Monarch is covering up. He also tries to warn them that his research proves that this thing could bring about the end of mankind should it be let loose. When the male Muto hatches out of its cocoon and begins to wreak havoc, Joe is inadvertently let out of the interrogation room due to the Muto's EMP attack, allowing him to escape and to finally witness the thing which he spent years trying to uncover, the thing that was the author of his pain. But before he reaches his son, Joe falls off a bridge and is mortally wounded by the Muto. The next day, in his dying breaths, Joe tells his son to get back to his wife and kid before it's too late, only to succumb to his injuries and pass away. For all of his limited screen time, Joe Brody is an excellent character, and it just cannot be overstated how wonderful Bryan Cranston is in this movie. In every moment he's on screen, there is so much passion and nuance that he packs into this role, and he absolutely sells his character's heartbreak through such a captivating performance, such as when he tells Ford that Sandra is still out there, while gazing out a window as he sees his illuminated reflection, when he goes through the ruins of his family's home and mourns what was lost, and when he expresses his understandable frustration towards Monarch for covering up what really happened on that fateful day. But even if we were to merely look at Joe Brody through text on a script as opposed to visuals on a screen, there is plenty to understand and look into regarding the nuances of Joe's personal trauma from his experience. While it would have been interesting to see how the film would have looked had he stuck around for a larger portion of the film, Joe Brody is still a well-realized, strongly written character to where his limited screen time doesn't even hold a candle to the craft that was put into him. Next up on the docket, we have Dr. Serizawa. Dr. Ishiro Serizawa, played by Ken Watanabe, is the head of Monarch alongside Dr. Vivian Graham, played by Sally Hawkins. They are both established as long-working members of Monarch who have worked together for many years, studying Titans, and have joined the organization due to their fascination and, in Serizawa's case, respect and admiration for the role in the natural order which Titans like Godzilla play. He views Godzilla as like a deity, a godlike force serving as the right hand of Mother Nature in order to keep the world in check. Even in regards to a potential threat to humanity like the Mutos, we get a moment where Serizawa actually shows a sense of pity before giving the order to euthanize the male Muto. This gives us an understanding that he cares about and admires all forms of life, as he would go on to verbally express and further bolster in the sequel, while still understanding what needs to be done in order to prevent further calamity and to protect mankind. Later on, Serizawa tries to convince Admiral Stenz that nuclear bombings won't stop the Titans due to them being overpowered by, or at least immune to, radiation, and that nukes have been tried on Godzilla before, only for Godzilla's return to be a clear indicator that a nuke just won't cut it no matter how big it may be. If anything, he tries to argue that the nuke will do more harm than good, and that nature must take its course, with Godzilla being allowed to stop the Mutos himself. However, Stenz refuses to allow such a gamble to be made. This anti-nuclear stance that Serizawa takes is built on the foundation of his father having been killed by the atomic bomb of Hiroshima, based on his father's watch, which we see him carry around. Right before the climactic battle in San Francisco and after the military's failure to keep the bomb away from the Mutos, Serizawa and Stenz meet once again, where the former affirms that mankind's best hope at that point is for Godzilla to win his fight against the Mutos, and restore balance in the natural order, as previously stated. Ken Watanabe, being the excellent actor that he is, does a great job at conveying the nuances inherent to the character through his performance, such as the grief we see from him when he shows Stenz his father's watch, and when he witnesses the awe-inspiring sight of Godzilla miraculously reawakening and returning to the sea. The rest of the characters are fairly well realized, despite not holding the same amount of depth or nuance as Ford, Joe, or Serizawa. Elle and Sam Brody, as the wife and son of Ford respectively, serve their purpose well as strong motivators for Ford to get back home as quickly as possible and to actively participate in the mission to stop the Mutos, thus giving him a personal stake in the whole ordeal. They don't serve as much of a sizable role as other characters, to be sure, but Elle and Sam are still well realized as a loving family worth rooting for Ford to get back to. Not to mention Elizabeth Olsen does a great job of portraying a woman who is shaken by the reality of giant monsters roaming in the world and potentially stomping their way to her family's home, as well as scared of potentially losing her beloved husband, especially knowing what has happened to Joe earlier in the story. Then we have Admiral Stenz, played by David Strathairn. Despite being depicted as in the wrong for signing off on and overseeing the nuclear bomb mission that would become the linchpin for the film's climax, he is shown to be a man who puts the safety of civilian life over anything else during an unprecedented crisis. While the film is ultimately on Serizawa's side regarding the issue on the nukes, the story still garners sympathy for Stenz as he tries to go forward with strategies that could yield the best results possible in terms of reducing casualties, giving the Admiral a solid enough foundation even in terms of being a side character. So far so good, we have a pretty good cast of human characters, so why don't we take a look at the thematic core for the film. Godzilla 2014 establishes a thematic core regarding the consequences of humanity upsetting a natural order. Consequences which could spell its doom should it fail to take heed of any warning signs. The male Muto hatches from his spore as a result of excessive strip mining that isn't properly regulated. Casualties in the Janjira power plant were the result of the plant refusing to shut down despite Joe Brody's warnings of what he initially perceives to be earthquakes. The US military attempts to kill Godzilla and the Mutos with a megaton nuclear bomb, only for the Mutos to obtain it for food for their offspring at the worst possible moment, which is after when the bomb's countdown is initiated. Godzilla represents nature's capacity to rebalance itself should mankind allow it to do so, as well as properly play their role, while the Mutos represent the consequences of mankind's attempts to control nature and failing to realize its place in the natural world, with the human characters representing various ways of how mankind tries to cope with uncontrollable circumstances. His overseeing of attempts in saving as many human lives as possible, to Ford standing among many other soldiers at a more boots-on-the-ground POV of certain disasters, to Monarch and Joe Brody trying to study and investigate these circumstances in order to advise or warn others. Dr. Serizawa puts it best when he says, and I quote, that the arrogance of man is thinking nature is in their control and not the other way around. That line alone ties the thematic core of the film in a nice big bow and will go on to represent the thematic through line in the Monsterverse as a whole. So it looks like we're going to have to call it for this part of my essay video series on Godzilla 2014. Stay tuned for part 2 where we will go into the monsters who are also characters in and of themselves and how they bolster the film's story as a whole. But until then, thank you for watching and I will see you all later.